Well, joining me now in Calabasas, California is Cuban-American Hollywood producer and director Robby Starbuck. In Washington, D.C., we have James Williams. He's the president of Engage Cuba, a coalition of private businesses and companies working to lift the embargo on Cuba. And Stephen Wilkinson is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Buckingham. He's also the editor of the International Journal of Cuban Studies. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Robby, let me start with you. So the Trump administration opening the floodgates to legal claims for Cuban Americans to get something back for their properties that were stolen. Is this necessary right now?
This has been necessary for a very long time. Our families have been waiting since, the so-called revolution happened, to have some semblance of justice for their life's work being ripped away from them. So, this is something I feel like Cuban Americans are very happy with the Trump administration for giving them an outlet. Like this is in a lot of ways purely symbolic because, no one expects to really get the land or money back at this point in time. But the symbolism of being able to hold somebody accountable, specifically, the parts of the regime that stole this from our families, is powerful for Cuban Americans who want to see justice served.
Robby, is it worth rolling back the thaw, rolling back all the strengthened relations between the two countries under the Obama administration?
Yes, because the first question I would ask is, what did it accomplish? What did Obama's policy in Cuba accomplish? How did it make American lives better? And I can't give you an answer that is worth the cost of what it's come with.
Okay, James Williams. Obama made peace with the Cubans, but the Cubans gave nothing back. Therefore, it's not going to change anything. This is worth it, according to Robby. What do you think?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, we've had an embargo policy on Cuba from the United States for 60 years, of which we could ask the same questions. What did we accomplish? What did we achieve? How were American interests advanced? How were the Cuban interests advanced? The goal of the embargo was regime change, bringing about democracy, capitalism, multi-party democracy, and free elections, and none of those things happened. And so it would be the definition of insanity to continue thinking in year 61 that things would change. And so while we, had a policy with Cuba that has been, we don't have to argue about the theory of it. We just have the evidence of 60 years of a colossal failure in every metric. We have no choice as reasonable human beings to try something different. And, we haven't really had a chance to see that through. Unfortunately, we're continuing with year 61 of a failed policy. And, that's a shame for the Cuban people and for the United States.
Okay, so that Libertad Act, 1996. So every 6 months, the president would sign a waiver, right? This time, President Trump and Pompeo saying, not so fast. We're not going to sign that waiver. Stephen, is this going to be damaging?
Yes, but I'd just like to correct you on something. You started by saying that these properties were stolen. In fact, under international law or recognized law, they were not stolen, they were nationalized, and the citizens at the time were Cubans, and it's accepted throughout international law that a state can nationalize the properties of its own citizens without compensation. So what you're talking about here are properties that were nationalized without compensation. Now, the Cuban state had every right to do that, and therefore the properties were not stolen.
Okay. Although, Stephen, I don't want to get ourselves entangled in knots here, but from the perspective of, say, a Cuban American who said, I had the title deeds to my land, and then it was taken away from me by the government, and I want it back. It was stolen from me, right? Can we agree to disagree in terms of the definitions here and look at?
No. It's very important because when you say it's going to cause trouble, it will
Tell me
cause
why.
trouble because of the legality involved. The law, which you referred to, the Libertad Act, and it is very controversial in terms of its reach, and the possibilities under this law are immense. What the law does is retrospectively give the right of citizenship to Cubans. It regards Cubans who were Cubans in 1959 as having been American citizens at that time. Now, that has never been done before, and it breaches international law, and it will cause enormous damage to United States relations if this law is enacted.
Robby, come in.
Intellectuals feel very comfortable bloviating about their interpretation of a law when they're not the ones who have, guns to their head having their land stolen. So I think it's ridiculous. It's absurd. These people work their whole lives, like my grandparents, my mom, they work their whole lives to earn a decent living and have a sugarcane farm and, one car, and the government comes and they take it. They say, what do you want to call it? If somebody walks up to you and steals your wallet, are you going to say they nationalized your wallet, or did they steal it? They stole it.
Stephen?
Can I come back on that?
Sure.
Well, again, this is a rewriting of history. These people left the island. They went to live in the United States, and they left their properties behind, and they left them empty.
But a lot of them, Stephen, because their stuff was taken from them.
They abandoned their land. No, subsequently to them having left. I mean, nobody took a gun to people's heads and took their land away. That's just completely wrong.
Yes, they did.
It's false and it's fake. It's fake and it's false. That's completely wrong. And you know it as well as anybody else.
Okay, so listen, so can we sort of find a way to disagree on the genesis of this, disagree on the revolution, which clearly, Robby is not a fan of, and Stephen, you disagree on the events that happened at that time. Let's look at the relationship right now, right, Stephen? And let me ask you, if the Cuban economy is going to be hurt as a result of this, or if it is just largely symbolic, as Robby said.
Well, the Cuban economy has been and will be hurt by the US embargo policies. We're talking about a whole range of policies, which incidentally haven't really changed that much, even though it was touted very much that Obama had made changes and so on. The changes that Obama made were marginal. They made some difference, but not a great deal of difference. And most of the embargo is still in place. And the Cuban economy is damaged by it. And the lives of Cubans living in Cuba is damaged by it. There's no doubt about that. And this will make it worse.
So
yes.
from the perspective...
How much worse? It's debatable.
Okay, so from the perspective, James, of the Cuban government, would it be, and here I'm assuming a lot, right? Would they be thinking, you ask us to open up our economy and we start doing so and we get foreign investment and so on and so forth, very slowly as we move from a form of communism to a bit more capitalism. And just when we do that, you give us a sucker punch and you have these claims in US courts. Is that how they're going to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, call me old-fashioned, but in the United States, I still believe in capitalism. Unfortunately, this Title III policy, it reeks of, almost socialism. The idea of companies, the United States taking money from companies and redistributing it to internal civil conflict in a foreign country of which the people at the time were not American citizens. Can you imagine if we applied this same standard to every country around the world, including our own? This would be a case for reparations for Native Americans, slaves, anyone who's had their eminent domain land taken by the United States government, any civil conflict in any country around the world. These people were not American citizens at the time. The United States' job is to punish their own companies and their foreign allies to resolve a dispute that they were not involved in. I mean, that would be lunacy. I mean, think about it. If we did this in Europe, in Africa, in China. And so, I mean, you can't just pick one country in the world and adopt a foreign policy we would never accept with any other country in the world.
Okay, so
it doesn't take away the pain. Right. It doesn't take away the problems that people experience. But it's not the job of the United States government to do that. That's unfair. It's an unfair expectation to hold this country to. That's not, what we're about. And unfortunately, I feel for people who had that happen to them, and it's unfortunate, but there are people in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in China, and virtually every country in the world where some civil conflict has happened, where there have been bad things that have been propagated by a government or an armed militia, and it is not necessarily the United States' responsibility, nor should it be, to solve that conflict for them and get them compensation on the backs of American companies. That's not the American ideal. And, it's unfortunate that we're going down this path because It's not our values.
So, Robby, at the heart of it all, James is saying that this is not helpful, especially not now. Do you at least accept some of that?
I wouldn't accept that it's not helpful because, that's a matter of your perspective in terms of where you want to go. I hear what he says about capitalism, and I would agree with him. I'm a huge lover of capitalism, but the reality is capitalism doesn't allow for the theft of private property. That's not a core tenet of capitalism. So if you really are a capitalist, you want to get to those core values. You want to see those reflected in your business relationships. You're going to find some, sense of disappointment in what you're seeing in Cuba and the way that their people have suffered.
I want to take this conversation on a slight detour and look at some of the regional implications of the United States and Cuba not being as friendly as they were under the Obama administration. I want to ask you first, James, if this is going to impact trying to find any sort of resolution when it comes to Venezuela, because the Venezuelans don't trust too many people right now these days, but they trust the Cubans. Is this going to make things worse?
Well, it really depends upon, yes, it will make it worse, and the extent of that will depend on how this Title III gets implemented and if it's fully waived. Right now, as Robby said, it's largely, it will be damaging, but it's largely symbolic. And so why would we do something that's damaging that has no real substantive impact for people? That doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, there are other ways for people to feel good about themselves besides damaging U.S. foreign policy. But the idea of fully implementing this, which is universally despised and disliked by our closest allies, Europe, Canada, and our countries in the region in Latin America, at a time where we're trying to bring regional and global consensus to isolate the Maduro regime or the former Maduro regime, is a huge mistake. What we need right now, there are very different politics on policy with Venezuela and policy with Cuba. The world has roundly rejected the U.S. embargo on Cuba every year. There is literally a statistical vote that happens every year at the United Nations, of which only 2 countries oppose it, the United States and Israel. So every country in the world but 2 are against the embargo. That is not the case in Venezuela. There are now 54 countries who have signed on supporting Guaido against Maduro. And so why would we want to jeopardize that at a very, very critical stage? I mean, right now, things are not going particularly well in Venezuela. The policy is really meeting some roadblocks and stumbling blocks as we're kind of searching for what to do next. And so this would be a really, really unforeseen and unneeded and unnecessary error at a very critical time. For symbolism, I don't think that is in the United States' interest, nor in the interest of the Cuban people or the Venezuelan people who deserve a resolution of this conflict.
Stephen Wilkinson?
Well, you've got to understand that there is a close link between what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening in Cuba, and that's Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is the architect of both the Venezuela policy and also this Cuba policy, and he is acting in the interests of very rich Cuban-American emigres in Florida who want this to happen. And the whole strategy of the United States, of course, is to attack both Venezuela, Nicaragua and Cuba together. John Bolton said it's a troika of tyranny and we're going after them. And this is part of an orchestrated and coordinated policy, and that's very evident and obvious. And when it comes down to it, this is ultimately a really class conflict across the Caribbean Sea. The people that are opposed to Maduro are the upper class bourgeoisie of Venezuela, and the people that are opposed to the Cuban Revolution are the former bourgeoisie and the upper class of Cuba. And you just see that these two factions are fighting a kind of class war.
Aren't you imposing very Cold War terminology on this? I mean, I feel like I'm hosting a show from the early 1980s here. Aren't the models outdated? Things are a little bit more complicated than that right now.
Well, you've got to talk to John Bolton and Donald Trump about that, and Marco Rubio about that. They're the ones who are making it into a kind of Cold War confrontation. They're the ones that are using this as a kind of geostrategic ploy. I mean, you can't divorce this either from the relationship between Russia, China, and the United States, and the ongoing rising confrontation between those two power blocks in Latin America. China and Russia have replaced the United States as chief trading partners to a lot of Latin American countries recently. And this is a challenge to the United States hegemony in the region. And so this is also part of a much larger geostrategic recalibration of US foreign policy. And that's quite clear. You can see it very clearly. And people shouldn't get bogged down into this minutiae of personal politics. My property was stolen, I want it back. That's just not what's going on here.
Robby Starbuck, the Cubans could be helpful in trying to fix the crisis in Venezuela. Why isolate them right now? Are you partial to that argument?
Not at all. I don't see how they're going to help at all. They support Maduro. They support the same socialist policies that have people starving in the streets, eating rats. So Cuba has no part to play in fixing the problems that ail Venezuelan people. In terms of the other countries that we need to help, that's why we are not allowing the Cuban-American citizens to sue foreign companies, like, say, Spanish companies that maybe own hotels or interests in different businesses throughout Cuba. But, in terms of Cuba itself,
something you'd advocate for?
Doesn't make any sense. What?
Isn't that something you would advocate for, though? The full implementation of Title III?
Honestly, I would, but not right now. I think that right now, while what's going on in Venezuela, it's wise to wait until the situation in Venezuela is taken care of.
James?
And I would ask Stephen, by the way, if he supports, if he opposes Maduro, or if he supports Maduro.
Okay, well, let's get James to respond to you first, and then we'll finish off with Stephen. James?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad there's a recognition that a full implementation of Title III would be a really disastrous policy at this period of time. And so why do it at all? What is the point? If we're not going to get financial restitution for people like yourself and your family, and it's going to hurt us in our efforts at a critical time in Venezuela, what is the point of this? We're just doing this for politics, or we're just doing this to make people feel symbolically good? I don't think it's really the job of the United States government's foreign policy to make people feel good without results.
Okay.
And so I think this is a huge mistake.
Okay. Stephen, very finally, Robby wants to know if you're a supporter of Maduro.
I'm a supporter of non-interference in a sovereign country. The United States has got absolutely no right to interfere in the internal politics of Venezuela. It's for the Venezuelan people to decide who their president is. And Maduro is the elected president of Venezuela, and that's a simple fact. And the only way this is going to end is very messily, not least for the Venezuelan people themselves, particularly the poor, who are suffering as a consequence of the United States sanctions on Venezuela. And that, is a fact. The United States is acting in the most outrageous way. It's behaving fundamentally illegally in Venezuela and should desist. But, of course, it's not going to do that because it's powerful.
Okay, I've got to wrap. We'll have more conversations about Cuba, Title III of the Libertad Act. We'll have more conversations about Venezuela and U.S. policy when it comes to Venezuela and beyond. But for the moment, I've got to move on. Robby Starbuck, James Williams, and Stephen Wilkinson, thanks for joining us here on the Newsmakers.